Greg.
Hello.
How you doing, Greg? You doing good?
I'm reading
Yeah.
Anna Kornblue's Immediacy. Um her book, it's not new, I guess it's 3 years old. It's her sort of theory of what's going on culturally these days. Um and it's kind of different from a lot of the writing about metamodernism because generally, even when we're trying to be neutral observers, those of us writing about metamodernism are usually kind of championing it, to some degree or whatever. But her immediacy is more of a critique of contemporary culture, and then immediacy is the concept she uses to explain her critique. So, like some of the authors associated with postmodernism were not promoting it; they were actually leveling complaints about the way culture was, and postmodernism was
Right.
their umbrella name for that. And that's kind of what she's doing. Um, and her complaint is that these days, um, in many areas, people have done away with mediation, have done away with um, interpretation of layers of complexity between the receiver of content and the content itself, um, and elimination of symbolism, elimination of multiplicity of meaning, ambiguity, elimination of there being any like difficulties or challenges in receiving content. Just come, you can get anything you want. Kind of all of that bunch of stuff. I'm not finished with the book, but I'm about 2/3 of the way through. But all of that stuff she sees as primarily a drawback to the way things are now. Um, and I think she misses for the complexity of both modernism and postmodernism, what they brought. And and it's interesting for me to read because it's not directly in opposition to metamodernism, and it's not the same as metamodernism. It's a different way of taking reality and making a map, around it. So she often uses examples that I have used to exemplify metamodernism, but to make different points. Um, so the things she dislikes about her examples are not the things I like. Like if we have example X, like say the TV show Fleabag, um, it's not that she's complaining about the things, the attributes that I kind of revel in and call meta modern, and she's complaining about them and calling it immediacy. Her focus is on some other aspects, or she breaks the aspects down into a different way of categorizing. So it's really stimulating for me, and I also connected to her on social media, so I'm aware sort of that um, she's a good social media poster, and I'm aware of, kind of how she thinks as a context around this theory. It kind of rounds it out. So anyway,
Well, that's interesting. I almost have a question for you. What is it like? I almost personally or intellectually, or however you want to take it, when you encounter someone who has I want to say different, I'm not saying it can't overlap, but kind of a different, maybe an emphasis or whatever kind of cultural theory, if it's fair to call it that.
mm,
When you yourself as a cultural theorist, you've done this work and you've seen these different kind of texts, how do you think about that? Is it like a competing where there's like competing cultural theories or different emphasis? How do you think about what the experience of encountering like a different cultural theory like that?
well, if it's compelling, which immediacy is compelling, her arguments are compelling. Um, I mean, I'm pretty much able to compartmentalize and read it on its own terms and Just the same way as if you're a musician, hopefully it doesn't ever take away your ability to just enjoy other people's music without comparing it to your own or things like that. And I think if something is compelling enough to get me over a certain hump, then I'm very friendly to it. And then I have another voice in my head that's monitoring and going like, oh, this is different. And how could these things, oh, here's something that might be compatible and, and all that. So it's mostly just, yeah, encouraging that someone is in the space. They're in the same
Mm.
space and they're doing good work. And um, I don't pretend or even want it to be the case that the models that I create or the models that colleagues who are fairly similar to me create are totalizing and, comprehensively explain everything. So I like seeing um, something that overlaps a little, but not a lot, or, in some ways is competing conceptually, but yeah. So that's me at my best when I encounter something which this work does bring out that side of me. And but there are some where um just like there are theories in any area, whether I have a stake in it or not, where I get a certain far into it and I'm like, yeah, this doesn't really seem like it holds up. This is kind of sloppy. This is lazy. I don't know if this is worth me putting time into. And, I will have that reaction if that thing deserves it.
Yeah, as you're speaking, I guess I'm interested just kind of reflecting on myself. Like, what exactly am I doing when I'm comparing theories?
Hmm.
Like, for example, if I'm comparing Adam Smith with Marx, or I've been doing a lot on what I think is kind of a deep debate in kind of in classical liberalism between Rothbard, Hayek, and Kirk. And I'm like, what am I doing? Am
Hmm.
I am I misreading these people's theories to put them to kind of see similarities that are not
Hmm.
there in order to bring antagonisms out? But like, why these antagonisms? Like, it's just kind of like versus others, right? Like, is that my own bias or is it a real tension there? Like, I think
Well, how do
basic
you end up that you're reading these things at around the same time? Like, is it just you pulled them both off the bookshelf or somebody suggested it or
That is a great question. So I read all of them. I don't want to say every book they wrote, but I go through kind of phases where I read a lot of Rothbard, a lot of Hayek, and a lot of Kirk, like in 2012, 2011. And you put them on your head, you kind of take out notes and you kind of think about them, but you put them away. And the reason I've kind of returned to them is because I'm hearing all these people coming up who call themselves post-liberal. And they're kind of saying the end of the neoliberal order. We're seeing even many of them are, kind of hard right. Even the stuff about democracy not working and being over, and it just tends to, and you're kind of hearing all that. And you hear, oh, this guy I've been listening to, Patrick, who's quite smart. I mean, he's not mean or anything. He's just making points on this idea that, the way that markets flatten all difference into, making everyone very similar, the
Mhm.
commodity form, all of these things, that this is not a way to form a civilization, that people then feel alone and they feel alienated, all of that stuff, and you need to return to civilization, and that can be tied to a return to religion, a return to nationalism, some sort of kind of grounding for people's identity. And of course, I think, reading Philip Reef and Berger and all that, I'm like, oh, those are some good points, but also this is very, very dangerous in other forms, because when you have that isolated person, to put it very generally, you get people who are very fragile and encountering otherness. And when they encounter otherness, things don't go very well. And if you're going to have basically the supply chain for modern technology, well, you got to get rare earths from China. You've got to get stuff from all over the world. So you're still going to be interacting with other nations and other cultures, but you've trained you're setting yourself up to not be able to encounter the presence of the other. And we could argue we haven't been. That's part of the problem of what's going on. We haven't really done that work. But I'm listening to the post liberals talk, and in your mind you're going, I remember stuff that Rothbard was saying about Hike. I remember stuff that Kirk was saying. I think these guys were actually framing and discussing this very, and for me, that
Problem.
tragedy, that kind of problem of hike that he's faced is actually the very problem that people are returning to right now. That is not being addressed. So when I look at the post-liberal people, I'm like, well, let me go back and show that this, you're thinking about this tension is actually the same tension that was never resolved. And a lot of people think it's a new debate and it's a new idea and it's a new direction. No, it isn't actually. It's already been done. And I think basically when we look at what Hike was not, in my opinion, Hike, the reason why I want to go back to that debate is because Hike, I think, points out what is needed to maintain the gains of, let's say, liberalism without falling back into something regressive or ultimately some sort of very problematic nationalism or something like that, which is going to be a system of coordination and interaction, which is going to get into people encountering difference and being able to handle that difference without overfitting or things like that. And I have to say more on that. But that's where I start kind of thinking back to that past and kind of going there and thinking about it. So that's kind of the experience for me. And then also because I'm curious about, the post-liberal and all these different tensions, then I also want to go and think through it with these different thinkers. But Nicholas, it is good to see you. Thank you for coming by this evening, sir. How have you been, Nicholas? We were just talking about the experience of like comparing theories and what it feels like to compare your theory. Greg Dember here is a fantastic uh, cultural critic. He does wonderful work on metamodernism. He's got a wonderful book on "Say Hello to Metamodernism." I can't suggest enough. But Nicholas, it is great to see you. How have you been doing?
Very good. Yeah, I mean, it's been a long time. I think the last time we spoke was a couple years
Too
ago.
too long, too long.
Yeah, a long time. Checking in from London.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you for jumping in. I made a trip from Rustburg back to the house. It's not quite the same as London to Zurich or et cetera, but I salute you in your travels. Well, Greg was also bringing up a book that I'm not familiar with on talking about immediacy and how today there can be this loss or kind of removal of the feeling for mediation, for the need to interpret, for the need to kind of think through things that things, as I understand, as he was describing the book, where things are presented in a manner where you could even say it's just the interpretation is done for you, if you will. You don't have to do any kind of work. It's given over in the immediacy. And that I find that very, very interesting because then also Greg has done wonderful work on how another way we can think about our moment is in terms of metamodernity, which has this kind of tension and movement between, and Greg can explain it better than me, but the movement between modernity and post-modernity. And I like Greg's book because for him, in that, there's also a honoring and defense of an interior space. And that interior space is very interesting because it would almost then, I'd be curious, like Greg, thinking about your idea of this kind of this defense or this honoring of an interior space, that would be precisely something in my mind that would go against the immediacy, or the very mechanisms of immediacy cannot help but at the same time actually create the conditions of this interior space. Do you have any thoughts on that at all, Greg?
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about while I'm reading Anna Kornbluh's book, is if I could have a conversation with her, I would say I feel like there are a lot, because she overall seems to be kind of cynical about contemporary culture, and she's decrying in example after example of this sort of immediacy, this flattening and thinning out. And then I would like to respond to her and I'd say, well, there's a lot of cultural products that seem to be attempting to fight this immediacy or deal with its unfortunate side effects and things like that. So, but then sometimes I feel like I can't pull that off while I'm reading her. Sometimes it seems like the things that I think of as meta modern, she can legitimately argue are immediatist. Um, yeah, it's very stimulating for me because sometimes I respond in different ways as I read it to different things. It's not easy to reduce the idea to my idea or to being the opposite of my idea.
No, and that's always a funny experience where you have an example that one person will use as evidence for X theory and another person will use as evidence for like Z theory. So, for example, on like the Rothbard, like Hayek would be like, there's something potentially very problematic about capitalism raising up the individual. And Rothbard would be like, no, that's exactly great. That's like exactly what the metaphysics would put forth as outstanding. And that, for me, always kind of goes to as well how those metaphysical difference actually manifest on what something is evidence for or not, or what case is it for, or is it good or bad. I definitely think it's interesting to think like how in an age that if there is something about complexity, and Nicholas, feel free to bring up anything you've been thinking about in general or et cetera, so forth. There is is never any pressure for anyone to say something relative to anything that anyone has said. It's fun to just see what occurs. That's a lot of fun. So, but it's funny for me thinking about what you're saying. I'm very interested in a thinker named Paul Virilio that talked about this increase of speed and how one of the ways that people are kind of controlled today is basically an acceleration where you can't keep up what's going on. There's a kind of speed that's happening, and therefore intelligibility is not possible for the average person. And when that's the case, they're easily captured or manipulated because things are just going so fast. I suppose Paul Virilio may have been talking about something like flood the zone before that was a phrase that was being used on CNN and things like that. But there's something about, too, where if we are entering an age that almost, I want to say, given its complexity, which is a loaded word, but kind of requires active discernment and active interpretation, like in order to actually kind of have a sense of what's going on or a certain sort of awareness that what you might be being manipulated, you've got to have that kind of self-defense. I can see where there would almost be a temptation to give in to immediacy because of the work of interpretation being so much on the person or the anxiety that it would demand of you. It'd be like, okay, I'll just let this thing. Well, and I guess that also goes into where increasingly more and more information. I'd be curious if there's examples of like meme culture as being a certain sort of like the image being put forth.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, as a kind of example of that immediacy, where you don't really have to interpret because it's cunning, it's crafty, and it's funny to think that if there's something about cunningness that actually can be problematic to being interpretive, and that does make me think. Michelle was talking about appearance in the kitchen a minute ago. That was really interesting. So I might put Michelle on the spot to talk about. Yeah, I'll throw it at you in a second. But it is interesting how now it's basically in an age of that immediacy. You've really got to force yourself to learn the work of interpretation and to not give in to the temptation of immediacy, or you're not going to do it. And if you don't do it, perhaps that would also affect to the degree you defend your interior space or at least manifest it in any kind of meaningful way, in any way whatsoever. But let me throw it to Michelle here.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe ask you, Greg, if like, because I didn't catch it all, but it seemed like there's this lady who has interpretations of things that you have a different interpretation of, right? Is it more or less one? Okay. I was wondering if like part of what is exciting about that is just the challenge of hermeneutics, where, you know, I don't know, anytime there's kind of a little bit of a contention, sometimes it can be a little bit more exhilarating because it's not just like, you know, it's almost the fact it reveals that it's not actually self-evident, you know, even though what you seem to be talking about, Daniel, is like the fact that there's this sort of, oh, well, we should just be able to, yeah, I do think there is a move away from like discernment in a certain way, but I think it's always still there. What I mean to say is that there could be this, oh, well, it's self-evident. There's really no work for the interpretation, but there's always interpretation, of course. And so if there's somebody who's there's something interesting about like, yeah, the self-evident, but also there does seem to be a metaphysical background or reality to the fact that we do interpret and we can interpret things differently. And also in an age where Daniel and I will talk about like the social coordination mechanism. Basically, there's all these markets online of like these potentialities for how you can potentially live. And what are the fruits? I mean, that's kind of a Christian term, right? But you could apply it elsewhere too. Like, what are the results, right? What's the outcomes of these certain ways of living? Okay. And we're all looking at that because obviously, even if people say, oh, I'm not for like, you know, obviously it's not merely utilitarianism. It's about like living a better life, you know, like it's just about living a more like full life, being more fully human. So yeah, we definitely do seek out and look at like the fruits, for lack of a better term. But yeah, I guess I was also thinking about this as it relates to appearance, because I was talking to this really cool lady and new friend who is really into color analysis. And I'm like, oh, that's so fascinating. And she's just really interested in it, like she just studies it on her own. Again, another benefit of YouTube is somebody can get passionate about something and they can go and learn it themselves and really dive into it. And so the long and the short of it is that, in one way, like there's a ditch on either side of the road where somebody can worry so much about what they wear and what other people wear and what does it say about them, and oh my gosh, like, oh, and just dismiss the person just because they're kind of messy or they've got stuff on their clothes, right? That's like the ditch on the one side of the road. But the other side of the ditch on the other side of the road is to say it doesn't matter at all and it has no correlation, But what this woman was talking about is the fact that what you choose to put on your body and ornament yourself with is indicative of also how you often feel about yourself. Like there is a narrative going on. So for example, I'm a mother. So a lot of mothers can fall into just wear the leggings and the oversized shirt, because it's like, oh, you're just, surviving motherhood. When really motherhood is an absolute joy and it's an absolute opportunity to create and, become more in your fullness of self, all while you also yield yourself to the, giving and nourishing of others. So anyway, what I mean to say is like being able to dress in a way that is like fitting for your essence, fitting for your body shape or your hair, all of that is like really, to her, it really matters. It really matters. And it changed her life because she was kind of stuck in a rut with how she viewed her self-image as a mother and all of that. But really like the way she presents right now is there's an aura to her, like it's beautiful. And it also, because you took the time to like learn hey, actually, there's certain colors that actually are better for me than others. And there's shapes that are better for my body than others. And these things are like, in a sense, they're not like, yeah, you could disagree, but you also just apprehend it in her appearance, and this is like, so there's something really like, in a sense, so unique and particular, subjective kind of, but there's also this like concrete, definite experience that people can have in an apprehension of her appearance because of what she studied and learned. And it also made her like live differently. Like she actually like lives each day differently because of understanding and learning that about that. So we're making homemade marinara from tomatoes. Yeah, we're making some pizza tomorrow. So yeah, homemade pizza tomorrow. That'll be great. So yeah. Anyway, I hope that's all making sense, but I think there's a lot there. And read. And I do think that what's that movie, babe, where like she's like soap can change the world, like the smell of soap. She's like there's like this funny movie. I can't remember what it is now. He's like a
We
famous.
saw it with a bowl. Damsels in distress. Wasn't that what it was? It was hilarious.
I think it was. What's that director? He's like a famous director. He does sort of quirky movies. But anyway, yeah, there's this one woman in this movie that says she just loves soap and she's smelling soap and saying how it's going to change the world. And I feel her because like, it's not like if you're really into aromatics, but colors can change like it's bringing literally like the colors of your clothing can activate something that's inherent in you. And what a wild thing, right? And like what a interesting thing that can be so overlooked and even thought of as frivolous or like vain, right? Or like unnecessary or whatever. And yet again, like for this woman that I met who really loves color analysis, it changed her life. And so, yeah, there's this, I don't know, there's just, to me, there's something really, really interesting there about this concept of interpretation, because again, you're going to interpret the way somebody presents. Right. But again, there's those two ditches on either side of the road. So I'll just throw that out there. But I think that's all pretty interesting. So thanks for letting me share.
Well, I guess as you were speaking, I'm now thinking about appearance to facilitate, inspire, or to direct interpretation and thus relation and conversation versus appearance merely as a personal expression, which there is a certain way when if I say I'm going to dress this way because this is who I am, there can be almost a antagonism to interpretation because people should just kind of understand this is who I am actually. But it is and maybe there's something about personal expression in that way that can err on the side of kind of anti-interpretation. Because now I'm thinking about, as Greg was speaking, like, and it's not all the same. I'm not saying it's all the same, but what are the things that happen in society that are inviting to interpretation? And what are the things in society that are antagonistic to interpretation? Right. And I think that also gets into what is your philosophy of interpretation? Do you find interpretation as actually fun and enjoyable and something to actually converse and work through? Or do you find it a threat and something you want to avoid? Right. And it's interesting to think of how do I dress and how do I appear to have an impact on how people are going to experience me, of which hey, maybe I'll learn something about myself that I didn't know I would learn about, right? Or that may challenge my own interior space to develop or something to come out of it that otherwise would not, right? And I'm now also thinking about what would it mean to, say, build a home and the aesthetics of a room in order to invite the work of interpretation, which is this kind of, oh, this is how I experience this room, or this is kind of how this activates these thoughts in me, versus making a room to tell your guests who you are, right? Like, this is who we are. And of course, those things can overlap, but there can be a form of telling people who you are that is saying, so don't you dare interpret me. Don't you dare kind of get other ideas of who I am. But then there's also efforts of expressing who you are, quote unquote, precisely actually to invite interpretation, precisely to invite conversation. And I'm finding that very, very, very interesting. But I'll throw it to anyone who wants to speak on anything like that difference and how there is something about an assertion of identity that almost can be like, perhaps in some forms, in immediacy that is actually shutting down interpretations versus inviting people into in appearance precisely to kind of have a kind of journey that is shared. I find that interesting, Michelle.
That's a really interesting distinction between mere self-expression versus kind of like creation of a tableau that invites various narratives and interpretation. And now I'm laughing at myself for getting like overly into this kind of theoretical language. Oh, see, and that's immediate. That's the immediatist in me is uh, wanting to being afraid of that. Anyway, okay. Um, so I originally, when you first started talking, Daniel, I would have thought that self-expression and this other thing that you're talking about, where it's a less specifically self-identified, just kind of discourse, I guess. Like instead of just decorating your home for the purpose of self-expression, you're decorating your home to invite conversations you can't even anticipate from other people. Anyway, originally I would have thought I would have put those two things, self-expression and then this kind of discourse thing, together in opposition to just absolute flatness with no expression and no meaning, no symbolism, etc. But I think as you continued expressing that idea, I was won over um, to seeing like mere self-expression is, in a sense, a part of immediacy. Um, and it does kind of seem more noble or fruitful, or at least interesting, to to create opportunities for discourse. Um, God, still, that sounds so pretentious to be talking about. We decorated our home in order to create opportunities for discourse. But it's it is actually worth thinking about.
No, I mean it's interesting because I'm thinking about that difference between expression to facilitate. And it's kind of interesting too, because then you can imagine some forms of expressing yourself that is for the sake of facilitating discourse. And thus you could say pluralism and difference and creativity and all of that stuff. And then expressions of the self that is basically like, this is who I am. Don't, that's the end of it, right? This kind of assertion against the other. And it's interesting, therefore, to think that an act the same activity that could invite the work of interpretation. Because to me, the work of interpretation is like inseparable from the indeed, Nicholas, is inseparable from the work of relationship ultimately. And the relation, like it's kind of like if you're not doing the work of interpretation with people, then there's a lack of humanity, or it's just linear, it's just kind of robotic. But when there is the work of interpretation, then there's something alive there, right? That can kind of happen. But then you've got to be willing to invite or to encounter surprise and the unexpected, and that could bring about a transformation in yourself or an idea that would make you have to rethink things, right? So then I'm almost wondering if there's been and again, these all, these are all live thoughts. There's something very interesting, I guess, what I'm thinking about as you've been speaking this evening about the slight, almost a kind of sleight of hand of individual expression. Like there's a way in which an emphasis on the individual, and this would kind of get to a little bit of Hayek's concern with Rothbard, like that there's this kind of emphasis on the individual, and that's going to open individual expression, and it's going to open creativity and different possibilities. But yeah, I'm wondering now about a certain sleight of hand where we use a lot of terms that seem to invite interpretation, like the creative expression, the individual, personal expression, or being yourself, or when actually all of these things, if one is not careful, instead of making, I want to say a shared architecture between people that actually invites the work of interpretation, instead actually keeps out the work of interpretation. Because there's another way too, in which it's almost like we say to one another, I'm a certain individual, and your job is not to interpret, but to read the text I've already created, and I've already have the correct meaning. And if you don't get that, you're not doing the work properly. Whereas instead, I do think it's a very different. I think you have a very different goal. I almost want to say in terms of design, like if you look at your business or your home or your book or your relationships and say, how do I design this not to personally express myself, but to invite that work of interpretation, to invite that relationality, to invite actually encounters of that interior space, encounters of kind of going in and bringing that out, which is going to require some degrees of your own personal touch. It's going to inevitably express your personhood because it's you doing that work. But that comes second to thinking about that facilitation to bring something out. And it's just very interesting to think of how not thinking in that kind of spatial way could end up being a form of a quote unquote immediacy that perhaps is more subtle, that we're not noticing, that we're not paying attention to, because it seems like it actually has a creative, like you went into yourself and found your true self and thus brought it out, right? Like you did some sort of inner work, but actually you may have just picked it because you saw some stuff at Hot Topic that you put on or at the mall, right? You didn't do any inner work. You just created an individual expression. I guess that's where my mind is going this evening.
I think that's interesting to think, especially about art as being on a kind of continuum or always needing to balance pure self-expression versus the creation of a space for other people to find their own meanings in the thing, or to, open them to questions that they will answer in whatever way they answer them, rather than with your own answers. And I think that for me, usually the most compelling art has a decent amount of both sides. It it wouldn't be all the way on one end of the continuum or the other, unless somebody is really good. Like somebody could make something on one end of the continuum that was just like so well done, and they're just so in that. Like if it's just creating a space for discourse, and I don't feel a lot from it, and it's almost just sort of a utilitarian project. It's like they're your teacher, or they're your your aunt or uncle, you know, kind of patronizingly making a space. Like I want to know that they have a stake in it themselves. I want there to be some selfishness going on in there. On the other hand, if it's purely selfish, and there's no room for me to take my own meanings out of it, then that can be limiting as well.
That's very good, and I agree with that because there is this form of when you have people that kind of say, we're going to have a conversation or we're going to make a communal space, and it has this kind it's like it doesn't work. You can't
Hmm.
just say that, right?
Yeah.
You know, you can't just say we're going to make a space for discourse, right? It's like I always like that C.S. Lewis line where he says, you know, when you plan to have a good conversation, you don't. Like you can't
Right.
plan for those kind of things. And there's something to be said about a work of art or an architecture or a space that is it is very interesting to think of the work of it. And I'm just using this phrase to kind of capture a lot this evening. How the work of interpretation cannot be directly approached, like the work of this bringing out for people to discuss and discourse, this space of discourse. This thing cannot be done too directly.
Right.
It has to be done to some degree indirectly. And that's where then you bring in the personal or yourself or your own
Yeah.
individuality in order to be the indirectness for that thing. But then, of course, the question is if you say, well, I'm just using my personal expression as a means to the end of discourse, that doesn't seem like it would work either because there's a
Oh,
kind of shallowing out. Please.
I think maybe it's actually most effective when it happens by accident. So um, the artist or whatever creator is not embarrassed to be trying really hard to make a self-expression. However, um, they take a general approach that keeps them open to unexpected influences, and there's just sort of inherently a softness and a porousness to how they are. And so inevitably, as much as they're trying to make something with a very definitive self-expressive meaning, they accidentally um, leave these openings. Or someone who is very purposely trying to do sort of a do-gooder, top-down, intentional, I'm doing this for the community thing, and accidentally they put their own stamp on it, and everybody else knows that the thing is very highly affected by their grieving of the loss of a relationship, that they've been unable to grieve in any other way. And so like but they weren't trying to put that in, you know, that type of a thing. Um, so I think it's like the accidental inclusion of the other pole is how it ends up working the best. And I see Michelle has her hand up.
No, that's interesting. I'll throw it to Michelle and Clayton. Wonderful to see you this evening. I'm now thinking about how perhaps that also points to what actually skilled comparative theorists do as well, because in my experience, let me put it this way, because we were talking about that earlier in my experience, someone who calls themselves a comparative theorist, like they say, I compare theories, they tend not to be very good at it. They actually are not very good at it, as opposed to someone who says, no, this is kind of my theory, this is my lens, this is what I'm working on. But they hold it in such a way that actually allows them from that orientation to say very interesting things about other theories, right? Like I have found like some of my favorite reflections on, say, conservative thought comes from, say, some of the Marxism or liberal people who are actually aware of it from their orientation that have a creative take on it. That's very, very interesting, or vice versa. It's just
Mhm.
that, unfortunately, usually, say, the conservative theory is too rigid to have that opening to say something interesting about the other side, or vice versa. And that's very, and now I'm also, and then I'll throw it to Michelle, and I'm now also thinking about what is it about the individual who expresses themselves and creates that space versus the individual who doesn't, like how they live their lives, or is it just kind of a happenstance? Is it what is it that leads the expression to going in one direction versus the other? Because like you say, it seems like you can't directly intend it. It has to just kind of emerge, which is a loaded word, and I don't mean to use it like a magic word, but let me throw it to Michelle here. Michelle, please.
I missed some stuff in there, so I apologize. But was listening in the periphery, and I heard your comment And I wanted to say that what I also found interesting about what I was learning through this new friend of mine who's into color analysis is that she was talking about the fact that like people can there's contrast and then there's something else that I forget what, maybe harmony or something like that. But something I also find interesting is that these categories aren't necessarily thought of as like bad, right? But they can show a person something about themselves, like because she also believes there can like be almost style wounds, like your contrast, like let's say you go really gothic for some reason, okay? If you choose to do that, you're making a conscious contrast. The conscious contrast is what somebody's going for with that, and it's a statement, right? And so what it means is that like potentially you're trying to do something with your clothing and with obviously making a statement because like for maybe, and it's not necessarily the case, but it could be that you feel that you cannot make statements in other areas of your life. So what it can maybe do, and again you get curious with it, you get sort of kind of let's excavate what this could potentially mean or point to in other areas of my life, because that's really what it's meant to be. It's almost like a tool to learn more about who you are and yourself and maybe other things that you're not always looking at, because again, it's easier to pick something that you can put on and off every day as a way to communicate something. So I hope that makes sense, but it's like, yeah, there's something about that that's interesting because like, I think the goal too of learning more about, you know, again, color analysis, body type, like your style, all of that is actually, interestingly enough, trying to find a unique expression of who you are, but not for the sake of like, well, I guess even overexpression could be potentially one of the could be one of the essences that's kind of coming out there. But yeah, there's something about it that's really kind of just, it's really more of like a tool to again get to know more about your own self that you can like again excavate for learning. Like you can learn about it and then you can just make decisions based off of what you've learned and who you feel you are. But a lot of times style is really just captured by, you know, capitalism or like what they tell you is cool or what other people tell you is cool, or the fact that you are trying to overly like maybe self-express through your clothes because you feel silenced elsewhere. So you know, if you the fact of the matter is like recalibrating that could actually allow you to also recalibrate the fact that you feel silent in other areas and learn how to cultivate a voice in other areas. But sometimes, you know, maybe I don't know, if somebody's like doesn't feel that they can, it might still come out in their clothes. Anyway, so that's all I was gonna that made sense.
No, a lot. And it's actually very interesting to think that there can be people taking up styles because they feel denied the space of discourse. They're denied the work of interpretation. They're not allowed. They feel like they're not heard, so they need to actually say take a certain style so that they're be able to be seen, right? So that's almost from a wound of then not being able to be part of the kind of the discourse or being able to enter the space with other people. And it's interesting to think of, well, I guess I'm thinking about, can one realize the proper style if they don't feel like they can quote unquote speak? Like you know, to use speak in a kind of loaded way, like are we actually able to realize whatever our colors or our expression is if we don't feel as if we're invited? Like, do we have to, if we don't feel like we're invited, can we actually have a proper expression? And it's almost like we live in a world of people that many people's expressions are a testament to a feeling of not being invited. And they're trying to be invited, or maybe they've given up on being invited. So they're like, forget it. This is just who I am. And that's the immediacy of that. Right. And then I'll throw it to Clayton here. And it's very interesting to think of the question of if I want to say right kind, non-wounded, maybe not, if the right if expression is possible without invitation, in a certain sense, kind of a loaded phrase. Can you have expression where there isn't a feeling of invitation, and it'd be facilitating interpretation, facilitating dialogue, facilitating relationality, versus cutting it out? Like, because that seems to be an interesting sort of question. It's interesting to think, therefore, if individual expression, like Greg was saying, if individual expression that then happens to actually have this discourse, relational character requires a context of some kind of invitation, some kind of hospitality, some sort of welcomeness. Where if you live in a world where you, I suppose, feel welcome, which is a loaded term, but then you can actually go and do your own individual expression, and it may better facilitate the work of interpretation. I'm not sure, but I'm now thinking of those together. But let me throw it to Clayton here. Clayton, thank you for coming by this evening. I hope you're doing well, sir.
So I'm catching this at the tail end, and the thing that has really stuck out is that question you're asking, Daniel, about can you express without the invitation? And I think in a way that it may even be more challenging than that. Can you recognize your individual particularity without being told that it's there? Like do you even know that you are an individual and a particular one at that? Because the reason I ask that is, like, and I've said this before, like, we always show up in the participation. Like, it's like we always arrive when the participation in which we are participating is already happening, and it's already happening to us. And then we gain our awareness of that participation as we respond to it. And so, and in the process of responding to the participation, we're figuring it out and trying to even, map out where we are. And so there is even no room for you to introspect to know whether you are a being, what kind of membership you have in this participation. There's no room for that, right? It's like you're just trying to keep your spot in the participation through the participation. And you have to do that for a while, like a long while. For humans, it would take you probably up to about, they say 4 years, but it's technically 5 years because you have been doing that from the time you were a single cell. And so, like, there was a year when you're in that other body trying to figure it out, and then you got thrown out of that body, and then now you have to figure it out now in this other space, which is not inside the body. And then you have to keep doing that. And then several years later, you gain some sort of awareness about you having some agency. And at that point, you start thinking like you may gain some hubris, right? Take it for granted, run several assumptions. But it's never the case. Like, even when you feel like you've gotten a grip on the participation and it makes sense, the participation is dynamic and it keeps shifting, but also you as an individual, a particular one at that, is also continuously shifting. And so you're shifting and the participation in which you are is shifting. It's all a whole kind of like movement, like a whole lot of movement going on. So I don't know if that can be directed with control per se, but I guess but we can respond with control, I guess. Like we have room to recognize the participation and our nature and how they've been working together, because we showed up late at the party, and then sort of try to continue that happening without breaking it. And hopefully that should unfold more for more participation and more development of our individual particularity. That would be, like, I would say, the best case scenario. Otherwise, it's simple, like, we get kicked out of the participation, end of story, and the rest of the participation moves on. And so it's kind of like boils down to those two options. Do you get to keep your spot in the participation, or do you get kicked out? And if you're keeping your sport, how are you keeping your sport? Because if you're not keeping it well, you are getting kicked out by the other participants and the participation itself. I've used the word participation too much and participants. I'm over it now. But yeah, like I feel like that's like you have to be told by the other things happening around you how to be and how to be with them. Otherwise, it makes it challenging. And I don't mean it in a bad way. Like sometimes maybe you have to be forceful, right? Like you have to break through a rock. But sometimes you have to kind of like dance with the rock, like live next to it and kind of like live in the rock. But whichever of those decisions you have to take is really not just from one position, I would say. Like it has to account for the other members in this scenario. And if we're not taking those members seriously, we're probably just increasing the chance for breaking the participation. And the participation does not like to take challenge. It fights back, and it fights back hard. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Very interesting. I'm now thinking, because there's something that there's something here about the individual. So if I just use a bunch of terms, there's something here about the individual expression on the side of immediacy, because Greg at the very beginning was talking about a book he was reading on a cultural theorist, talking about how our age is defined by a certain immediacy versus mediation, where everything's immediate. Like you have the image, you don't really have to think, and it kind of crowds out interpretation. There's nothing to interpret. You just kind of take it in. Here's the headline. You're done, right? And how there's a weird way, I guess I was thinking about, rightly or wrongly, it's interesting to think how there's a form of expressing who you are. And Michelle was also talking about appearance. That can be like, if you say, for example, I don't know, I wrestled for 8 years. Oh, I'm a wrestler, right? There's one way I could be doing that says that's who I am, so there's nothing to talk about. I'm a wrestler. And then there's what got you into wrestling? That could invite you in, right? And so there seems to be one form of expression, and that would of course apply perhaps to any kind of expression of the person, right? There's one that could be immediately nothing to think about. I work at Apple or something. I work here. And then there's another that's kind of inviting in, right? And how then, of course, perhaps if we are trained by immediacy, maybe that increases the likelihood that personal expression is shutting something down versus inviting something in. So we were kind of discussing that. And I'm now thinking about, there is something very interesting, like you're saying, you have to be told, let's say you have to be told you're an individual, right? So you could say that starts with a power move. Let's say a power move, right? Like that's who you are, right? And then you can develop that. And if you don't develop that, you don't have anything to participate with, right? But then it's almost like you have to I can participate with power by saying I'm a wrestler, so I have a seat at this table because I'll Granby you or something, right? Or I make a lot of money, so I get to participate because I have power. Or there is I'm a wrestler and I get to participate here because, that's interesting and people will be interested and we'll kind of invite people in and we'll discover something together, right? But it's very interesting too, because I'm now also thinking, so there's some kind of switch that has to happen that maybe gets tied to development, some sort of kind of blossoming or some sort of development, right? Where you have to actually, you have to move to expression, to inviting people in. And I guess what I'm thinking about now is, why is it that so many people I personally, such as both of y'all, enjoy speaking with or find discussions with y'all are of this kind of dialogue character, or this invitation of interpretation, or just this conversation we've been having now that you didn't know you were going to have. And it's like, what is a common characteristic of people of whom that seems to appear for? And it's, a lot of it is that they've written books or they've done paintings or they've done and the reason why that's important is because if I tell you I'm a wrestler, for example, that does invite interpretation, but you're also not sure if it does, right? Because it's like, but if I give you belonging again, even I have to admit that that invites interpretation. Even I may not like your interpretation. I may have an idea of what the book means or heroes or whatever, but I can't deny that that form of personal expression must bring about the work of interpretation. But if my personal expression is my identity, I guess, or status or label or work, it seems more difficult, perhaps. It seems more difficult for that personal expression to lend itself in the direction of interpretation. It seems more likely for that personal expression to be on the side of immediacy that is not inviting interpretation. And maybe also it's too close to home. You know, maybe it's all like if I say I'm a wrestler and you say, oh, I don't like wrestling, you know, you've got to hurt me, right? But but if you say, oh, I didn't like that short story that you wrote, Esperanza or something, that would still suck. But I'd be like, well, I'll write another one. There are other stories. So there's a certain sort of distancing that is happening now. Clayton, did you have something to say, sir?
Yeah, no, you sparked a thought there because I was speaking to Bob. I think you've spoken to him as well, like I met him through Seth.
Oh yeah. Great.
Yeah, and so he has his motto, about polycentrism, and in one of those conversations we've had, he's spoken about the difference between individuality and personality, and I think the thing you're describing there has to do a lot with the tension between those two, between individuality and personality, because the personality, I think, now that I think about it, like even what we just spoken about, has to do a lot with the structure, like the recognized participatory structure, and so that's why it's very limiting. That's why it's sort of like limits your way of responding because it's been recognized and it's a certain kind of shape. And so it's sort of like it is the one trying to shape us. It has like a molding type approach. So it calls for that kind of relation. It's like if you're relating to it in that way, you are arriving in a way that is going to make you be molded. Like, so you have to be soft in a certain way and accept that you have to be shaped because that structure is larger. But at the same time, you're not just soft. Like you have that almost monadic individuality that is within this soft shell that is being shaped, and that too must not be crushed. And so the tension between balancing out which part gets shaped and which part remains rigid, I think that is one of the core problems you're pointing at there. And it's a huge challenge. And I think like the example you gave, like most of the people who are engaged in this discourse are like really, really wondering about how this works, have had to do a bit of, I would call it like walk in a double realm. Like in the nervous system, they would say, excuse me, like it's mostly outward facing, like all our senses are gathering data about our environment. But not just that, they're also inward facing, like a part of the nervous system is inward facing to gather data about what's going on internally. So, of course, like the external sensors are more, so our attention gets drawn more externally. But I guess like, what the Eastern people do, like, if you like really work hard and become a monk, separate yourself from the immediacy that is trying to mold you, you may get a slither of a moment where you can tune into the internal, you'd say, nervous system that is sensing what's going on internally. And I think once you have had that perspective, so now it's like almost like a dual direction. It's like now you're in the middle of both directions. So you cannot completely ignore that individuality, which is kind of like shaped a certain way. And also you can no longer ignore the personality and the expression and where it's being molded. And every time you lean too much to one of those, things break on the other side of it. And so like the real work is to walk that line and kind of like try and be aware of both sides and kind of like if you go too far, bring it back, or if you go too far this way, bring it back. And it's real hard. I don't think there's ever one answer to address it. Like I think it's a repeating task that like it starts again. Like it every time it has to restart. Like because with each progression, let's say if you take the progression as a day, you do make an upgrade. Like you get changes and your particular individuality gets upgraded through all the mistakes that got made in that progression of the 24 hours. And then you're going to try and fix that in the next progression. But at the same time, the progression around you that's molding you is also having to remold the new version that kind of like emerged. And so it just goes and goes and goes. And yeah, it's crazy. It's just crazy.
No, magnificent. And I appreciate you jumping on in the middle of work and sneaking away to a corner. You're a good man. And I'm now thinking about that recognition. And if anyone has anything to final say, we might jump in a minute so I can chase Paul, who is nevertheless going to the barn again. This is like his 30th time. But what's just very interesting, I guess I'm thinking it's almost like, and I don't know how far I want to push this, but it's something almost just kind of where you're saying, it's almost like I'm thinking about the likelihood of, maybe I'll just language it this way. The likelihood of personal expression to fall into immediacy without the work of art or creativity, like creating something. And it's almost like it's almost like personal expression is just very likely to be immediacy, not inviting interpretation, unless you're also making something. Like I'll just say the work of art or maybe a creative work. That's what I'll say. And that they have some kind of dialectic. And if you don't do that, you're not going to have that recognization that you're describing. And I guess I'm also thinking about like if I do personal expression and someone asks me, why did you do wrestling? Then I have to get into wants, desires. Typically, people don't like talking about wants and desires. They're also like mysterious. And it's like, how do I even talk about that? What would it mean? And then it's like, oh, so what did your mom do? And now it's psychoanalytical. And I don't like that interpretation. That's a little too close to home to get into wants and desires. But if you ask, why did you have Eve do this in this story? Or why did you, okay, why do you think Philip Reeve has something? That's inviting invitation. That's not getting so close so quickly into psychoanalytical things, right? And so then you can say, talk about the work of art, and then that could maybe lead to, well, the reason I write this story, because it takes me back to wrestling, which I got into. My dad was a football coach, and then that was in the culture, and see how it can lead to then it. And it's almost as if it is very difficult to have personal expression and maybe personal relationships in general not fall into the trap of immediacy instead of inviting interpretation, unless you have some sort of creative work. Now, when I say that, it doesn't necessarily have to be writing a book. It could be theoretically doing a garden or a family or a house. So I'm not trying to limit it just to that, but it's just very interesting to think of. I almost want to say using object. I don't want to say objects might be strong, but isn't it interesting to think that objects can invite interpretation that leads to personal interpretation, where, there's always that subject-object divide and all that, but actually it's almost like you need objects in order to actually get there. Otherwise, you don't. So I'm now thinking about how personal expression needs creative work not to fall into immediacy. And I don't know how hard I want to push that, but there's something where in order for personal expression to facilitate interpretation, the creative work is extremely important, or can really, really help that for yourself as well, right? For that, so you can actually have, because when you create and write something, and then I'll throw it to whoever wants to speak here, like when you write something, yeah, you reinterpret yourself. because I wrote that. And who must I be? Like, you reinterpret yourself, right? And then if you're reinterpreting yourself, that can make you more comfortable with someone else interpreting you in new ways because you're used to doing it to yourself. And now you're able to emotionally handle someone else doing it. And in fact, you can see how it's not scary, but it's what opens a creative possibility, actually. But I'll throw it to anyone who wants to say anything.
I just throw like a little line. Sorry, Greg.
That's okay.
It's a feedback loop. It's a feedback loop.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what you're describing, Daniel. That's what's coming to me. Like, without the feedback loop, you really cannot know how you're doing what you're doing. And so the way you know is in that loop. And so it's very paramount, like the object, like the creation is giving you the power to express your way of molding. And it's that way of molding that then, because once you see it, then you know how you mold. Then you're like, huh, okay, I guess maybe here's how I can improve. Or maybe when I molded it this way, because then you can reflect. You see the mold, then you kind of like resonate with it and go like, yeah, I could do better this way. Or it will throw you in awe and you go like, wow, I did that. And so that sort of like gives you some feedback, I guess. And I think that's why it's key. At least one reason why it's key.
Totally.
I'll stop there.
Totally,
Yeah, thanks.
totally agree.
Oh, I was just going to say, Daniel, that this observation that you were making here at the end it's right in line with Anna Kornblue. Clayton Anna Kornblue's the author of the Immediacy book that we were talking about. It's right in line with her because she spends a lot of time on the breakdown between art and self-expression, like obviously in YouTube culture and influencer culture and, even what we're doing here, like is kind of part of that. Like, and we think that it's cool. Like we're like, yeah, we're having this like open-ended discussion and we haven't been given authority by any kind of gatekeepers. We've just put ourselves there and but we're allowing people to observe the conversation. But we're in our homes and sometimes our kids walk, all of that. Like the normal narrative would be like that's a cool thing. But if you're critiquing it if you're critical of immediacy and you have that lens, you might criticize it and say, we're kind of causing a breakdown between elevating art and having elevated conversations that were rehearsed and kind of plotted out and have a level of intricacy that might not be possible from the spontaneous and things. And obviously, I do see the merit of what we're doing, but I like to be able to see it critically too. And yeah, and so and she takes a look at influencer and autofiction and all these things that kind of seem cool to me, but now I kind of see her point after reading her book or after reading 2/3 of her book.
Well, that's fantastic that she gets into the very distinction on the art and personal expression. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think that I think that is extremely well taken. It's one of the reasons why I think it's extremely dangerous for people, say, on these, let's say, online spaces to demonize universities or to say that those spaces are bad, right? I've been reading a lot on, just as a closing thought before I jump here and read, Paul makes this. And I appreciate everyone coming out on this evening. And thank you for bringing up that book, Greg. That's fantastic. And yeah, I've been reading the Josephina Quinn, How the World Made the West, Peter Falafopon, and both of them talk about the Silk Roads and the role of roads in the formation of societies. And they really want to argue that there's a bias for civilizational thinking. Like we like to emphasize the West or the East. And, one of the things that Dr. Quinn goes through is shows that even when you talk about like Plato and Aristotle, you say, oh, that's the West, right? Well, they're talking about Egyptians. Like Plato's always talking about the Egyptian thinkers, right? And they're always talking about the Middle. And they're really also, too, she fights. And I really love this section where she talks about how we have this idea that, say, the Islamic civilizations preserved Aristotle, right? They kind of translated the text. And she says that's true, but what you get is this impression that they were almost a pass-through civilization, when really they were translating the text to debate them, to add to them, to refine them. So it wasn't like this idea that Aristotle was the greatest thinker and therefore we need to make sure he passes on into the future. But no, that translation was an active activity of scholars wanting to debate it. And really what's just very interesting about the history of the role of roads and interconnectivity is that I think what you see in these books is the importance of the importance of those transitions, those roads, those interconnectivity, which I would associate with spaces like this, but then also how you cannot demonize the civilizations, or you cannot demonize. What you need to see is all of those different civilizational spaces are interconnected, and that you need the authority, you need the people who are actually doing the work of translating Aristotle, not just saying, let me put out my metaphysical system. It's like, well, have you read Aristotle? No, I don't need to read Aristotle. It's like, no, we're going to do, like, to me, what was so beautiful about that example is that translation was a simultaneous activity of honoring the greats, but to participate with them. And I think that starts to get into, for me at least, what I hope, there's a kind of ideal in that, right? An honoring of the universities, but also the Bloomsbury group meeting nearby, right? That's also part of it. And I think it's really, really important not to demonize the experts, because I do think if you do that, it's going to go into the personal expression at the expense of the mediation and the work. I completely agree with that. But thank you, Greg, for coming by. I appreciate you seeing this evening.
Pleasure.
It's been very, very fun. And Clayton, thank you for coming. And y'all have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much.